We're talking about race relations here in the tri-state area. In brief, what do you see as how relations are going between people of different races here in this area?
I think Quincy is still a very segregated community. It's not really talked about very much. So many of the things that somewhat surprised me when coming to the area was that a lot of race-related discussions aren't being had in the way that I'm sort of accustomed to coming from more of an urban area. So it almost seems like many of the things that would normally be talked about in a community of this size and with the amount of diversity that's here are sort of swept under the rug.
What sort of things are you talking about are not being discussed?
Well, when I got here, one of the major issues, I got here around the time where they were discussing changing street name or something like that to Dr. Martin Luther King Drive, and there was a big groundswell of discussion about that. But really, in other arenas, particularly, like I said, talking about the segregation, talking about the achievement gap in the schools, talking about many of those issues that are everyday sort of issues. I don't really hear a lot of discussion about those things in this area.
What would you attribute as the reason why you think they're not discussing these things?
That's a great question. I think, and this is really only coming based on anecdotal evidence for me, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there are not many minority people in positions of power in this area. So I think a lot of the potential for discussion gets sort of lost in translation. Many of those things would be discussed in board meetings and meetings of potential stakeholders that have something to do with some of the decisions that go on around town. I don't really see a lot of that occurring. When I look at the school board, when I look at university boards in this area, I don't really see a lot of diversity. So honestly, I wouldn't expect a lot of discussion about many of those topics.
So because there's nobody who has a vested interest, you're not really seeing those issues being brought up.
Sure. Vested interest. I think that when I talk to people who are not in positions of power, there is interest. There's a lot of discussion among those people. It's actually getting that information to the powers that be, the people who actually shape policy, make those decisions about which types of programs are going to be offered. The school district, for example. There are very few, if any, minority educators in the Quincy School District. Just as an example, this university, Quincy University, and the other universities in there are very few minority faculty members or administrators in these universities. So again, I wouldn't expect a lot of discussion about race and issues of diversity to come out of that.
Do you think that communities like this try to find a status quo where they're comfortable and don't push those issues forward?
Absolutely. I think that the status quo is definitely a big determining factor in whether or not people will really even be perturbed enough to have an issue with the way things are. Some of it is status quo. Some of it is that people may not be aware that these things actually exist. But if you're taking a good look at what's going on around you, I mean, like I said, school data is published public information. It's no secret that there's a significant gap in achievement both at the K-12 level and at the university level between different ethnic and racial groups. So
obviously, we're talking at least in one sense about the black community, but there are also other races in this community.
Sure.
Do you feel that they're even less represented and getting less of a voice? Those other racial groups in the community?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that it's sort of a universal problem. You see more representation in areas, like I said, that have larger populations of ethnic and racial diversity. But it's still something that really needs discussion in this area on a more deliberate and concerted effort that goes for or in line towards making those things come to fruition.
In the 60s, obviously, revolutionary times, major things happening in the world with race relations and that sort of thing. The 70s, we saw some of that still kind of tapering in, still going on, but it began to kind of fade away. The 80s, it kind of faded away in large part. Has the fire left the community, both the black community and other racial groups? Has the fire left them? Is that the reason why we're not seeing people still fighting hard for these issues and they're not being put in the forefront of the national conversation?
I think one of the things that I think that's a great question. One of the things that Dr. King himself talked about was this sort of lull or urge toward complacency once you have these overt injustices leave. So you're not seeing people being abused by police overtly in the street. You're not seeing them being lynched overtly. Those kinds of things. Once those things are removed, he talked about that people would start to become more complacent, and that was one of the things that he actually warned about in his last book. So I think we are seeing a lot of that. There really isn't a fire. There really isn't a sense of great need for many of these discussions to take place. The reality is, among many scholars and many people that deal particularly with retention and achievement gap and those education-related issues, that we are falling farther and farther behind, particularly the Black community is falling farther and farther behind, and no one is really coming to the forefront and saying anything about many of these issues. So,
one of the things that strikes me, and it's been this way throughout history, a generation goes through something, and it has, as I mentioned, a fire. But they don't pass that fire
Sure.
on to the next generation, and then the generation after that has even less of that unless they hear it in a history book or something like that. What can people here in the tri-state area, in the Quincy area, do in any racial group to begin to rebuild that fire and rebuild that impetus, both from education and just in the sense of general living, to reignite that in the community?
I think the first step is always awareness about the actual needs, the actual disparities that exist in society. But that's only one step, and many would argue that that's an insufficient step toward true progress. With that awareness, there have to be people that are committed to whatever cause we're talking about. Once you get that, then you can begin to make some decisions about which areas need to be tackled first. For example, Quincy, the tri-state area, there are many issues. We could sit here and talk about them for days, but what is the most pressing need? And those kinds of discussions, having honest discussions about those things, is something that really needs to take place if we're going to see any true progress occur.
Without trying to make it sound the wrong way, but does Quincy need a Dr. King to rise up in this community or in this area, someone for whom this is an important issue, to sweep people around? Can a group do it? Can the NAACP do it? Can other groups in the area, can they bring that about? Or does it really need a figurehead in a community like this to begin to bring this issue forward?
I think figureheads in their sort of grand purpose, they do promote awareness to some degree. But the reality is, even in the civil rights movement, there were many people behind the scenes that were doing the actual work that it took to get these things to come to pass. So I think that possibly having a figurehead that may do something to motivate people, but the real work takes place with the people themselves, coming to some sort of conclusion about what needs to take place. I personally think that ultimately we need to have more ethnic diversity, more racial diversity on these committees, in these positions of power around the area. Once you start to do that, then the voice has an outlet. The voice has a chance to be heard. Some of the issues may come to light for again, the powers that be.
I don't want to skip over this. We talked about some of the stuff, but I really want to touch on this, the educational gap, which you've mentioned
Sure.
several times. Why do you think there is, when people would say everybody's in the same classrooms, everybody's getting the same teaching? Why do you think there is this gap?
I think that and there's been research that suggested that essentially people can internalize their own oppression. People sort of take on characteristics, these stereotype characteristics that people in the dominant group sort of impose, and they start to believe them, internalize those beliefs, and become self-defeating. That's one side of it. But the other side, systemically, is really that there really is no representation within those groups. So even a person in my position, being the only African-American faculty member at a university that has 10 to 15% black students. I mean, those kinds of things matter, and those kinds of things really do go a long way in helping people feel like they are sort of part of something bigger than themselves. When they don't have that representation, they sort of feel alienated in those environments.
So even though everybody's in the same class learning the same lesson, they're not really seeing examples of themselves achieving and stuff.
Right.
So they don't believe that they can make that move
Sure,
themselves.
sure. Yeah, their examples are sort of these caricatures of what the minority stereotype is supposed to be. Now, every group has those caricatures, but at the same time, in many groups, you may get some positives out of that. This is what I'm supposed to be if I'm a white male, and that may lead to some idea of success or prosperity or whatever, caretaking, whatever it may be. Versus someone from a more marginalized group having the belief that they can't achieve those goals. So definitely representation has a lot to do with it.
Okay. Let me ask you kind of an unusual question. Yeah. Minority students, let's say primarily black students,
sure.
What can they do to help other minority students deal with this issue in this area when other people from other cultures come and maybe they're not represented here, but they're not the black group where you've kind of got a history? Sure. How can they help them adjust and deal with those sorts of issues?
You know, one of the characteristics that I've found, and some researchers supported this as well, that members of marginalized groups, they tend to compartmentalize their own experience. And unfortunately, that does nothing to help them realize that there are other marginalized groups as well. So you see issues related to black students not taking on mentoring roles and not supporting other students from other cultures at the higher ed level, for example, when the reality is that they're going through similar types of dynamics that you are, and the potential ability to help lean on one another is there, and it's not being utilized effectively. So what can they do? They can become more aware of their situation and sort of see that they're not much different than these other students or these other people that are having similar struggles.
Does the schools like Quincy University, do you provide a means or an avenue by which they can break down those walls and see the similarities of their journey?
Well, Quincy University is getting better, and I would say that universities across the country are getting better at recognizing gaps in retention, gaps in students feeling like they are comfortable or safe or capable at universities. They're getting better at trying to bring in more diversity-related programming and things like that. They are far from at an ideal place. But here at Quincy University, we've recently offered a position and had someone fill a position for the Director of Minority Student Services, and that really has gone over well for us. Students are feeling more connected with the campus as a whole as a result of that. So things like that, efforts that universities put forth are honestly paying big dividends in terms of minority retention in particular.
And is that coming because there are active minority voices who are saying, hey, we need this, hey, this is important to us, hey, you need to pay attention to this issue?
I think that's a big part of it. A big part of it also is that university executives, they pay attention to what works. It's sort of a copycat organizational experience. So they look for what other universities are doing to close their retention gap, their achievement gaps at the university level, and try to mimic it in some sort of way. And that's one of the things that is showing some promise for helping with that retention gap.
We're almost done here, but I do want to ask you about something. One of the aspects of the civil rights movement, one of the big aspects of the black culture for many, many years, because of slavery and other things like that, was the family base.
Sure.
And having a solid family base that supported, and as the movement began, the family, came together and they stood together and it became a part of the movement. Our families are very different now.
Sure.
Father's not in the home, single mothers raising 2 or 3 kids, all these different sorts of things. Do we need to get back to that as a black culture, specifically talking about the black culture in the community, and begin to address those issues and begin to put that sort of solid foundation underneath our children again to help them move and get their eyes open to the possibilities before them?
Absolutely. The black culture used to be much more community focused, much more communal in general. Mothers that weren't necessarily biological mothers of these children walking through the neighborhood, that they would say something. They would get on board with trying to correct certain behaviors. Absolutely, we need to get back to more of a community responsibility for how our children turn out. And I would say that everyone needs to get on board with that. Everyone has a community responsibility to these children that we are, as a society, are failing. So it's not necessarily just a black issue. It's an issue that what do we say about ourselves when we allow our children to fail to succeed as a society? It's something that we all need to get on board with.
Another question comes to my mind. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
In my mind here. A few years ago, there was really a big talking about, what's the cost of slavery?
Mm-hmm.
How much can white people pay for it and that sort of
Sure.
thing. The fact of the matter is that a lot of black kids have white friends and, Hispanic friends and different things like that. And as a friend, you're not trying to lay a burden on your friend. What can minority students do to help white students understand their situation, understand where they're coming from, but not make them feel guilty for something that happened long before they were born?
Sure. Now, one of my research areas is oppression dynamics. So, oppression dynamics suggests that not only is the member of the marginalized group a victim of his or her own oppression, but also members of the dominant group. So in that case, white students are also victims of societal oppression in believing in their own unearned privileges that they have gotten simply by being white. So not to promote guilt, but to promote awareness that there are certain privileges associated with a person depending on which identity they hold to be valuable for themselves. Those kinds of things need to be discussed. They need to be talked about. That in itself will help people to understand a little bit more about the struggles that people have. The discussion between men and women about the male privilege that exists in our society, the fact that men make or women make 72 cents to the dollar of men. And those kinds of discussions need to be had. It shouldn't be something that we just sweep under the rug and pretend like they don't exist. Those discussions, I think, are really a good starting point for dealing with some of these issues.
I'll share a bit of my personal history with you. I was in 5th grade when Roots came out.
Uh-huh.
The day before, hanging out with friends, black friends, white friends on the playground, fine. The next day after the first episode, black kids and white kids didn't know how to look at each other.
Sure.
And didn't know how to talk to each
Sure.
other, because what had been a paragraph and a half in a social studies book and half of a drawing was all of a sudden live on our television.
That's right.
And it was a whole different thing.
Yeah.
And that split, I still remember to this day, where it was so uncomfortable. You didn't know how to talk. And as I think back on it now, there was just this, what do we do?
Sure.
And I just wonder, are we moving past that, or are we still in that what do we do phase?
Great question. A similar dynamic occurs even at the college level, and I would imagine occurs K-12 when racial or gender-specific issues come up that may speak to some level of discrimination or possibly even privilege in the classroom. Research suggests that teachers or faculty members who actually engage in those discussions do a lot more in teaching their students that these discussions are okay, versus the faculty member or teacher who sort of skips over it and acts like it's not a big deal. When they do that, they are sending an inadvertent message, an indirect message to those students that you shouldn't be talking about these things, and these discussions are not welcome in my classroom. So part of your story and part of what I heard in that is that the adults that were in that environment, if they could have come forward and let you all know that this was something that is okay to talk about. Right. Your discomfort is okay to talk about when it comes to these issues, which you saw. Mm-hmm. That may have made that transition a little bit more easy to digest.
Yeah, see, I never thought of that because, it was the 70s, late 70s,
Mm-hmm.
I think is when Roots came out. And I never thought about that as much for the teachers. It must have been very uncomfortable.
Sure.
To figure out how to navigate this when everybody was watching it on TV and your kids were coming into school with it. But this had never been a discussion.
Sure.
I mean, this had never been talked about. Just like you said, it was this little thing that we quickly read over in class and we were done and moved on. So yeah, I never thought about how that must have been for them to try and figure out a way to be able to even bring that subject matter
Yeah,
up,
absolutely.
which left us as kids going, what do we do?
That's right.
Wow, I never thought about that. That's really something. We're about done here, but I want to ask you to kind of to talk as though I'm a member of this community, which I am, but talk to me as a member of the community, and tell me in a wrapping up summation sense, what does Quincy, what does this area need to do to move forward on this issue of race relations and bridging some of these gaps?
Sure, sure. I think Quincy as a community has a lot of potential that's out there in terms of there are many members of the minority community that appear to be very vested in making sure that we're attempting to close some of these gaps. However, again, they're not really in any position of policy making. So I think that as a community, if there is more of an active approach or more of a concerted effort to get members of the Redmond Lee community, these communities, we all know about going past 12th Street, those kinds of discussions. If we're actually having those discussions in a meaningful way, these issues won't be swept under the rug. These are issues that need to be addressed if we're truly suggesting that we're a community that wants to deal with them in a meaningful way. And members, there needs to be representation on these policy making, these policy shifting communities and boards and action committees or whatever they are for the particular organization.
Would you say also that minorities, whatever their minority status might be, need to take ownership of these issues as well and to step up to say, hey, I want to be a part of this?
Absolutely,
hey,
absolutely. The discussion always goes back between individual responsibility and systemic responsibility or societal responsibility. But the reality is that get into that discussion about who's right or whose issue is this is sort of a moot point. The reality is that it's everyone. It's the individual. It's also society's responsibility to try to deal with these issues. Yeah, I think Quincy has the potential definitely to move forward in an effective way in talking about race relations. It's just taking that first step and trying to get there.